Hi, my name is Sage Gerson, and I'm a fifth year PhD candidate in the English department. For Pandemic Book Club this week, the text I'd like to share is Sarah Monique Broom's 2019 National Book Award winning memoir, The Yellow House. The Yellow House is Sarah Broom's debut book, though she did spend decades working as a journalist before writing it. And The Yellow House recounts just over a century of Sarah Broom's family's history in New Orleans. Sarah is the youngest, or as her older siblings call her in the book, the babyest, of 12 children. A large, sprawling family created by and brought together through both her mother and father's second marriages to each other. Sarah's story centers on the Yellow House, Sarah's childhood home, a shotgun style house in New Orleans East that her mother bought when she was 19 years old with the insurance money from her first husband's death. Ivory May, Sarah's mom, is the first person in her immediate family to buy a house, and though she hopes to buy something in the hustle and bustle of New Orleans, she eventually ends up on the outskirts of the city, 7 miles from the popular French Quarter, in the Yellow House in New Orleans East. Sarah emphasizes throughout the book that New Orleans East, with its junkyards and trailer parks, was a place the rest of the city mostly ignored. And she also emphasizes how popular romanticized imaginaries and tourist experiences of New Orleans erase her experience of the city. The book is amazing, and I'm going to spend the next minute or so giving you 3 reasons why you should read it and why everyone on this thread should read it. The first is the important ways that The Yellow House illuminates the embodied consequences of systemic racism through its reflections and ruminations on and rememberings about Black American homeownership, colorism, the disinvestment in and forced underdevelopment of historically and culturally Black communities in the US, poverty, addiction, government corruption, and the environmental violence and racism of Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath. The second reason that the book is amazing is that it takes the time to linger over Black joy, love, and kinship making, all while celebrating the ways Black culture forms the heart of what is famous about New Orleans: its food, music, style, festivals, etc. And Sarah is always quick to celebrate her own family's contributions to these cultural productions. So her father, Simon, was a jazz musician, her brother is a chef, her mother designs and sews the family's stylish clothes. Um, and additionally, my last and third point and pitch for the book is that there's so much pleasure in reading the book because Sarah's stylistic storytelling and writerly voice are so well defined and so unique. I'm going to share 2 sort of examples of Sarah's stylistic choices and writerly voice that I'd like to highlight. And those 2 things are her account of Hurricane Katrina in the text and the way she makes her family's long history and deep roots in New Orleans legible. So, to this second end, Sarah opens her memoir in 1915 with the birth of her mother's mother. In fact, despite The Yellow House being a memoir about Sarah's own life, she doesn't appear as a character in it until around page 100, where she introduces herself as a child. Instead, she opens the book by writing on page 9, "By bringing you here to the Yellow House, I have gone against my learnings. You know this house not all that comfortable for other people," my mother was always saying. Before it was the Yellow House, the only house I knew, it was a greenhouse, the house my 11 siblings knew. The facts of the world before me inform, give shape, and context to my own life. The Yellow House was witness to our lives. When it fell down, something in me burst. My mother is always saying, "Begin as you want to end," but my beginning precedes me. Absences allow us one power over them. They do not speak a word. We say of them what we want. Still they hover, pointing fingers at our backs. No place to go now, but into deep ground. In this way, Sarah's memoir performs a powerful matrilineal genealogy of self-understanding and identity. It also makes clear from the beginning that Sarah defines herself through her kin and who she loves, as well as where she is from and where she feels she belongs. In her work reorienting her reader to the New Orleans of her early life, after she has introduced herself as a character, she spends a chapter presenting what she calls my map of my world, which is its own chapter starting on page 116. My growing up world, she writes, contains 5 points on a map, like 5 fingers on a spread hand. The farthest dot away from me in this universe, the thumb, is grandmother's house in St. Rose. We call her house the country, even though there is little open land, except on former plantations. The banana yellow Aries that we take to the country is the same car we take to Schwegman's supermarket on Gentilly Boulevard, pointer finger of spreading hand, which is one of my favorite places to act a fool. The other 3 points on the map, my middle, ring, and pinky finger, are clusters. Our house and the short end of Wilson Avenue where we live, Pastor Simmons' house church where we go now that mom is feeling more Pentecostal than Catholic, and Jefferson Davis Elementary. These are the places that make up my growing up world. The book is peppered with family photos and includes entire sections written in italics, which Broom uses throughout the text to indicate when she is incorporating direct quotes from family members, often her mother or siblings, in order to preserve their voices, perspectives, and accounts of events. It is in this manner that Sarah recounts the events of Hurricane Katrina. Broom is no longer in New Orleans herself, but working as a journalist in New York City and living in Harlem. But most of her family is still in the city when Katrina hits. Narratively, she steps aside and lets the voices of her mother, brothers, Carl, and Michael, and others tell the story of what Sarah titles Movement 3, Water. That she is not in New Orleans for Katrina really makes Sarah feel guilty, displaced, and uprooted, which is something she grapples with throughout Movement 3 and Movement 4 of the text. Through her vignette and absent storytelling style, Sarah refuses to participate in a retelling of Katrina that spectacularizes it. Instead, she contextualizes it within long histories of earlier hurricanes, of segregation, and the ongoing broken, limping, and uneven recovery initiatives in the city. And the second half of the book is really focused on New Orleans as it attempts to recover from Katrina and how uneven and unsuccessful the recovery initiatives from the government really are. And I think to my point about Katrina not being spectacularized in the text, there are 4 movements that make up the memoir, and the actual hurricane only takes up one of those movements. Katrina is significant for Sarah in part because it is what scatters much of her family throughout the US to California and Texas, for example, forcing them to leave the city. Katrina, however, is not a discrete act of violence, nor is it represented as such in the memoir. And Sarah shows the ways that the hurricane was exacerbated by the US's and New Orleans' long history of racialized violence. In fact, it is after Katrina that Sarah moves to and lives in Burundi, from which she powerfully places Katrina and New Orleans within a transnational context of forced underdevelopment, exploitation, and environmental violence. To this end, she writes near the conclusion of the book, "The street mostly changes in the small, cumulative ways of decay. These ways do not easily draw attention. If one pipe bursts beneath the concrete, creating a running puddle, it takes on the look and appearance of every pipe that has ever burst and every puddle that has ever run." So while I was reading The Yellow House, I thought about a couple of other scholarly readings that I wanted to pair with it because it helped me, I feel like, understand Sarah Broom's project in The Yellow House. And the first concept that I'd like to bring in and just share with you all and share my thinking about is Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence from his 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. He defines slow violence as, and I quote, "a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. Violence is customarily conceived as an event or action that is immediate in time, explosive and spectacular in space, and as erupting into instant sensational visibility. We need, I believe, to engage a different kind of violence. A violence that is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales," end quote. And I bring Rob Nixon's concept of slow violence in to my thinking about the Yellow House because one of the powerful and meaningful ways Sarah Broom represents Katrina is not as itself a singular spectacular event, but instead as not erupting into instant sensationalism, but happening across a range of temporal scales, and that kind of sense of delayed destruction of violence dispersed across time that are really remarkable in her representation. Clyde Wood's 2005 article is the other piece I'd like to triangulate here. And the article is titled, "Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans? Katrina, Trap Economics, and the Rebirth of the Blues." Clyde Woods opens the article by writing, quote, "The Katrina tragedy was a blues moment. The legitimacy of the United States is dependent upon multi-ethnic and multiracial cooperation at home and abroad. Yet it affirms its status as the architect of a new world order by denying the existence of racism. Katrina has exposed both the absence of social justice and the futility of this plausible deniability dance. The blues tradition of explanation and development provides both a way out of the inner workings of inequity and a way into the third reconstruction. The picture of 20,000 slowly dying African Americans chanting, 'We want help,' outside of New Orleans Convention Center was a blues moment. It disrupted the molecular structure of a wide array of carefully constructed social relations and narratives on race, class, progress, competency, and humanity. In the blink of an eye, African Americans, an identity fraught with ambiguity, were transformed back into Black people, a highly politicized identity. Mass suffering simultaneously killed the dream and learnt the blues to the hip hop generation. Katrina's message was unmistakable," end quote. And so, though, while I like and think it's powerful the way that Sarah Broom thinks about the distribution of Katrina across space and time, I also think she's unequivocal in her recounting of the hurricane, of its message, of what Clyde Woods writes as Katrina's unmistakable message. And that's very much a part of the text as well. So I have a couple closing thoughts and some discussion questions. And the last thing I'll say before engaging you all is that after finishing the book, I was left thinking a lot about ownership and belonging. I think in the US, with our Euro-American focus on property, ownership is often falsely equated with belonging somewhere. Sarah's memoir, however, I think recasts ownership as a system of dislocations, and instead, in my opinion, quite profoundly lingers on what it means to belong somewhere and how to make that belonging legible in a system that relies on ownership instead. So to launch our discussion, I'd like to ask you all about where you're from. So Sarah critiques popular representations of New Orleans, such as those written by Joan Didion in The Yellow House. And so I'd like you to think about where you're from. Have you encountered films, TV shows, or books about it? Do they represent the place as you know it? Do they help you feel that you belong from there? Or do they make you feel that your experience there is illegible or erased? If you were to tell your story of where you feel you belong, how would you begin it? Where would it end? And then lastly, we've all been spending so much time inside our dwellings during pandemic. We know that being home isn't safe or possible for everyone, despite some of the ways some media is idealizing families at home right now. I found Sarah's story of her childhood home, her fraught relationship to it, and at times to her family, but also her love of the way the Yellow House brought her family together and facilitated her sense of belonging, to be a particularly impactful read right now. Have you read anything about home or family recently that you would recommend, or that brought a new perspective to your pandemic situation? Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to the hopefully ensuing discussion on Nectar. Please feel free to weigh in on either of the discussion questions or on anything that I've talked about here, or shoot a recommendation for a memoir you've read recently that you would think we should read into the Nectar channel. Thank you so much.